Hey everybody, welcome to another episode here on Bully Whispers, and we're here today to evaluate Gus Fring in the context of Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. Unlike the other 48 Laws episodes, where we evaluate one law in depth for the entire series, in this episode we will be following only Gus Fring on his quest and evaluating his actions and strategies. Of course, in order to evaluate his actions and strategies, we kinda need to determine what his goals were first, and although they seem pretty straightforward to us viewers, he does a great job of concealing his intentions from almost everyone else. Basically, he wants to set up his own independent drug distribution network north of the border and dominate the drug trade in the southwestern United States. Now, despite the fact that Madrigal was involved in the building of the super lab from the very beginning,
Well, it could work.
I don't think that distributing in Europe became part of their plan until later, but we'll get to that in a bit. In order to achieve this goal, he knows he will have to gradually build independence until he's ready to take out the cartel, which he will have to do, all the while building both his super lab and his crew on the hush, and along the way he ends up facing three main opponents: Hector Salamanca, Lalo Salamanca, and Walter White. Quick side note, while there are enough historical dates, locations, etc. to sort of piece together Gus's past, it would take us way off course. So, for the purpose of this episode, we're sticking to what takes place during the Better Call Saul Breaking Bad time frame. With that in mind, right off the bat, Gus is working towards setting up his own thing. However, unfortunately for him, he's not Mexican, he's not a member of the cartel, he never will be, and he knows it. So instead, his first step towards gaining independence is to actually entrench himself deeper into the cartel, and we start to see a tiny glimpse of his plan during his first meeting with Mike. His goal is to make himself more valuable by decreasing Hector's value, and he wants Mike to do it so that it's less traceable to him. Now, during this conversation, there is one exchange that is very significant on two levels.
You care to elaborate?
It's not in my interest for Hector Salamanca to die at this time.
Who is he to you?
Associate of an associate.
How very specific.
First, not being specific is something that Gus is very good at. It's part of the reason he's so good at concealing his intentions, and he was very consistent with it up until towards the end, which we will get to later. But for the immediate future, what is much more significant is that he doesn't want Hector to die yet, and we will get to why in a second. Spoiler alert, it's probably not what you think. Shortly thereafter, we see his plan is working. Not only is he kicking up way more money, but he is also upstaging Hector in terms of packaging as well. Now, it could be argued that he is violating Power Law 1 by outshining the Master, but remember, he's under Juan Bolsa, not Hector, so this is really the first step in making the actual boss dependent on him. It could also be argued, knowing that he needs Hector to mess up at some point, that he is just employing Power Law 39 to get under Hector's skin.
Your opponent is of choleric temper. Irritate him.
Personally, I think this was just a result of his OCD nature, but either way it starts having that effect. It upsets Hector so much that he immediately storms into Gus's restaurant and demands that Gus start being his mule as well, which is exactly what Gus wants. He wants Hector to start overstepping his bounds.
May I ask, did Don Eladio approve this?
And it's working.
I approve this.
Emboldened by this, Hector has his guys take 6 keys instead of the 5 that they were supposed to, and it's here that Gus really starts to demonstrate his mastery of the art of timing when he lets them take the 6 in order to keep the peace for now, and we see why shortly thereafter. He is about to start the process of building the lab. Now that he's got the ball rolling on his lab, he needs to expand his team, and there are 2 main people that we see him do that with: Mike and Nacho, although through entirely different methods. In Mike, he sees an excellent potential soldier who he can trust, and he wants Mike to genuinely be on his side. So he finds out what truly moves Mike, the thing that means the most to him in the world, and he plays to that.
Would 20% overcome this difficulty?
I would not take money from your family.
Of course, Nacho is a different story, but we'll get to him in a bit. Moving back to his conflict with Hector, his plan is working perfectly. Everything now moves through him. It works so well, in fact, that if you look at Gus, who usually has a pretty good poker face, if you look at his left cheek, which would be the right side of the screen, you can see that he can't help but flash a slight half smirk. Of course, he says he didn't ask for this and he doesn't want it, but he does get Hector to officially step over the line, which he does again shortly thereafter during the next meeting, this time in the presence of an actual cartel member.
The boss can sock me.
I'd watch what I say if I were you.
However, as well as his plan was going, he was thrown a major curveball when Hector had a stroke, and he immediately jumped in to save him. In hindsight, given that we know how he goes on to torment Hector, I bet he wishes he had given Hector mouth to mouth. I mean, how much fun could he have had with that to taunt him with? But see, that's the thing. There is no way he could have known Hector was going to be half a vegetable, so that's not why he didn't want him to die yet. Which begs the question, why did he save Hector's life? Now, Gus claims it was just instinct, but he isn't the kind of guy whose first instinct is to save a life. He's the kind of guy whose first instinct is to save himself, as well as his clean public appearance, which he does throughout both series. And being caught with this crowd could be dangerous. His first instinct would have been to leave like he told Bosa to do. No, he saved Hector because Hector going down would be very, very bad for him. You see, not only did Gus know Hector well, but he also knows the next Salamanca who will take his place, and he knows Lalo is much smarter and less easily manipulated than Hector. So, unfortunately for Gus, he would soon be dealing with Lalo, but he did make good use of this event in two ways. First, he prepped Bolsa for the idea that someone will attack the Salamancas, sensing Hector's weakness, essentially setting the stage for someone else to take the blame when he starts disrupting the supply up from Mexico. It's important to note here that even though he now controls distribution north of the border, at this point he can still only sell cartel product. Second, he notices some shadiness around Nacho, and after following him, he discovers Nacho's role in Hector's stroke. Now, unlike with Mike, who he genuinely wants to be on his side, he doesn't trust Nacho. So, when Nacho shows up trying to take 6 instead of 5 again, Gus kills the other guy and lets Nacho know the deal.
You are mine.
Of course, later he switches the threat to Nacho's father, but either way he now has an inside man in the Salamanca crew. He then uses this incident to fake a robbery/attack on the Salamanca guys, which Bolsa had already been prepped for, and since he now has Nacho in his pocket, he is able to blame the Espinosas. But by far the biggest impact of this whole incident, as far as Gus's long-term plans are concerned, is that for the first time he is given permission from the cartel to use outside suppliers.
Find a local supplier on your side of the border.
Which he will use as a precedent later on, and even though he says he always has, we know that's not true.
Don Eladio forbids buying from outsiders. It's been very clear.
After all of this, construction gets going, Gus toys with Hector's health, and his top engineer going AWOL throws a monkey wrench into the whole plan. Now, in and of itself, this wouldn't have been too bad, just take care of Ziegler and move forward, but unfortunately for Gus, this all happens around the time of Lalo's arrival. In their initial meeting, even though they had never met face-to-face before, it's clear that they are both quite familiar with each other, and right afterwards we see one of the main differences between Lalo and Hector, which is probably the reason why Gus wanted to keep Hector around. Lalo is very hands-on.
Show me.
So it's no surprise that Lalo begins following Mike, and when Gus realizes that Lalo knows about the engineer and a construction project, he knows he's in a tough spot. For starters, things were just starting to get going. The lab was underway, he finally had permission to sell non-cartel product, and had Hector still been in place, he could have been able to continue forward, because Hector lacked the thoroughness and attention to detail to ever catch him. But Lalo, on the other hand, is a different story. With Lalo, he attempts to explain a recent shipment of lower quality by making Ziegler the scapegoat, and then attempts to explain Ziegler's mere presence, as well as the construction project, by showing him a construction project, just not the right one. Of course, Bolsa believes him because Bolsa wants to believe him since he's making so much money, but Lalo isn't convinced and arranges for one of his guys to start feeding information on Gus's operation to the DEA. Fortunately for Gus, he finds out about it from his inside man Nacho and is able to prevent the raids from doing too much damage, but he knows he has to get rid of Lalo and he knows it can't be in the US. So he has Mike arrange for Lalo to get arrested for the murder he had committed, and then give Saul Goodman everything he needs to get him out on bail, knowing that he would then have to go back to Mexico before they figure out who he really is. In this capacity, Saul Goodman was the perfect cat's paw, since Lalo knew of him because of Tuco and chose him on his own, so he would have no reason to think Gus was at work behind the scenes, and the same can be said about Nacho, who will find himself at the center of the next phase of Gus's plan when Lalo takes him back to the Salamanca ranch in Mexico. However, when the hit on Lalo failed, we see the danger in using the cat's paw. If you are found out, there is no denying it, and you may even find yourself being accused of things that you actually had nothing to do with. Fortunately for Gus, Lalo only told Hector that he was still alive, and nobody believed him, so while this particular instance didn't end up being so bad for Gus, this sort of thing will come back to bite him later.
Who do you know? Who's okay with using children?
Also, fortunately for Gus, he knows both Hector and Lalo well enough to sort of piece together what was going on and not be caught totally off guard. He knows Hector well enough to know that this would never ever happen unless Lalo was alive and there was something in the works. I mean, he might as well have given him the Godfather kiss of death, it was so obvious. And he also knows Lalo well enough to know that Lalo isn't the type of person to get talked out of things. So when he finds out how easily Lalo was talked into sending Kim to his house to kill him instead of Jimmy, he knows that his house isn't the real target, and he knows what is. From here, Gus puts on his plot armor and heads to the lab where he manages to kill Lalo, which, quick side note, is probably the best thing that could have happened for Crazy 8. If Lalo had killed Gus and survived, then Crazy 8 would become a useless cat's paw to him, since he no longer has to feed info to the DEA. On top of that, not only would he be useless, he would be dangerous because if the cartel ever found out that Lalo uses other people to feed info to the DEA, regardless of the circumstances, he would never be trusted again and probably be killed immediately. At this point, with Lalo dead, Gus's only real loose end is Nacho, and he uses Nacho's dad to get Nacho to take the blame, which pretty much clears Gus as far as anyone not named Salamanca is concerned. From here, we don't really see anything from Gus until a man named Walter White enters the picture. With Walter, Gus treats him much differently than he does most people. Now, I'm not going to get into it too much here because I cover it more in depth in another episode, but if Gus was just finalizing the details of European distribution before he died, despite the fact that Madrigal has been involved since day one...
If this is such a slam dunk, then why didn't you pitch it to Fring?
I did. He said yes. We were in the final stages of working it out. And somebody killed him.
Then Europe wasn't part of the original plan, which does make sense. Their product is chemical, not largely plant-based to the degree of cocaine or heroin, so its production isn't geographically limited. They have their own normal quality product over there, so it wouldn't be worth the risk or expense to ship it across the ocean. This deal came about because the purity of their new product made it valuable enough to take that risk. So, considering how Gus may have incorrectly felt his European venture depended on Walt, at least for the time being, it's easy to see how he might feel he is joined at the hip with Walt on this one. Either way, for whatever reason, we can see Gus acting differently with Walt from their very first real meeting.
I don't think we're alike at all, Mr. White. You are not a cautious man at all. Your partner was late, and he was high.
Gus is usually very good at keeping his mouth shut, and does so at first, saying he doesn't know what Walt's talking about, but for some reason he eventually acknowledges who he is for a man who, at least at that point, he doesn't want to work with. Eventually, Gus decides to test Walt and see if he can deliver in 1 hour, which he does, so Gus decides to offer him a job. Unfortunately for Gus, Walt no longer wants to cook, so he pulls out all the stops to try and get him back into the business. First, he knows Walt's thumbscrew is his pride, and he effectively gets Walt to start talking again by showing him that Jesse is cooking his product. Now, Walt claims to see through Gus's attempt to stir him up, and that he has no proprietary pride, although he clearly does, but then Gus shows him the lab. That, combined with a little more ego prodding,
And a man provides.
gets Walt back into cooking. Unfortunately for Gus, his long-term plans hit a bit of a hiccup when Walt says that Gale isn't a suitable assistant.
It's as if I'm classical, but you are more jazz.
Don't really care for jazz, though. A lot of unnecessary notes.
So, Gus allows Jesse to be Walt's assistant in order to keep him happy, which ends up being a very big mistake. All the while this is going on, Gus still has the cartel and the DEA to worry about. Bolsa demands answers as to why he stopped the cousins from getting revenge on Walter White, but then he unwittingly opened the door for Gus to use the cousins as a cat's paw to solve multiple problems. Of course, Gus offers them Hank, then warns Hank, so there is a shootout, with one cousin dead and the other critically wounded. He knows that if Lionel lives to tell his story to the cartel, he's a dead man, and Bolsa saying that it's innocent until proven guilty in the United States probably reminds him of Lalo, except he can't let Lionel get back to Mexico. So he sends Mike in to finish off the job and make it look medical. By now, Bolsa pretty much has figured out what's going on, but due to the friction Gus stirred up, he would soon be killed by federales, leaving no one to tell the story to the cartel. This means smooth sailing from here, right? Wrong. Jesse is about to create some problems. After Jesse confronts Gus over the use of children, Gus agrees to take care of it if Jesse agrees to keep the peace, but when Tomas is killed shortly afterwards, things come to a head. When Walt saves Jesse by running over the dealers, Gus meets with Walt, and Walt lays out the options.
And so, if I may, I would like to review options with you. It seems to me you have two. Option A, you kill me right here and now.
What is option B?
I continue cooking.
Gus agrees to let Walt keep cooking, but with Gale as his assistant, which was his plan all along. However, he also lets Gale know that he will be taking over very soon. When Gus sends men to kill Walt, Walt turns the table and has Gale killed, knowing Gus would still need him to cook. Now, again, I'm not really going to get into why he killed Victor because I cover it in another episode, but by this point, from a 48 Laws standpoint, Walt thinks he knows Gus well enough to think that he can manipulate him through practicality.
You're too smart. You can't afford to do this.
But his killing of Victor quickly put an end to that impression with Walt, Jesse, and Mike. From here, Gus begins the process of separating Jesse and Walt until he faces his next big threat, the cartel. After robbing one of Gus's shipments without keeping the product, Gus agrees to meet with them and offers a severance package, but he says he is done with the cartel. The problem with that being, they aren't done with him. So when they start shooting at Gus's operation, he agrees to capitulate and take Jesse down there to teach them how to cook. Now, this is where his concealing of his intentions really pays off because remember, they don't know he has a lab at this point. They know he uses outside suppliers, but not that he has a lab. If they did, then they would just take it over, and there would be no reason for this trip. So, as far as they know, Jesse is just the outside supplier being brought down to teach them how to cook, but of course Gus has different plans. In an act that risks his own life as well, Gus manages to kill almost the entire cartel, leaving him right where he wanted to be. He had his own lab, distribution network, and now he no longer had the cartel on his back. Unfortunately, Jesse's affinity for Walt prevents Gus from killing him before he can capitalize on Gus's two main shortcomings. First, as mentioned earlier, Walt is able to use Gus's reputation for using kids as cat paws to turn Jesse against him, which leads to the exploitation of Gus's biggest weakness, one that's actually fairly surprising given his personality. For someone who is known for their efficiency, keeping Hector alive for so long seems very counterproductive, more like something the Salamancas would do. Now, it's very easy to overlook how out of character this seems with the rest of his personality since Breaking Bad aired first, so we see this side of him pretty early. But it doesn't fit well with the rest of his personality, and it ended up costing him his life. Had he killed Hector long ago, or even just not shown him to Jesse, then Walt wouldn't have had any real means to get to him without going to the DEA, which would destroy his family. Well, thanks for watching this episode here on Bully Whispers. As always, like, comment, subscribe, especially if you like this different format, and I'll see you at the next score.